You haven't heard true silence until you've sat inside a soundproof broadcasting booth at 3 a.m., 10 miles from the nearest paved road. It's a heavy, pressurized kind of quiet. It pushes against your eardrums, trying to fill the void where sound should be. My name is Elias, and for the last 11 months, I've been the graveyard shift engineer for Crocs FM, a dying classic rock station clinging to life in the Cascade foothills of Central Oregon. We broadcast at 50,000 watts from a concrete bunker surrounded by endless acres of Douglas firs. The locals call us The Box. I'm not the DJ. I don't have a radio voice, and I definitely don't have the personality for it. I'm the guy who makes sure the automated playlist software, an ancient version of Audio Vault running on Windows XP, doesn't crash. I monitor the transmitter output, log the Federal Emergency Alert System tests, and fix the wiring when the rats chew through the coax cables. Most nights, it's the easiest paycheck in the world. I sit in the main control room, surrounded by racks of blinking servers and the warm amber glow of the analog Wheatstone mixing console. It's a mix of high-tech and museum pieces. The smell is specific, a combination of stale Robusta coffee, ozone from the amplifier racks, and that dusty, heated plastic scent that old electronics give off. It was Tuesday, October 14th, when the routine started to feel off. My shift had started normally at 11 p.m. I swapped out with Dave, the evening guy, who looked even more exhausted than usual. He mumbled something about the noise floor being high tonight before bolting for the door. I didn't think much of it. In analog radio, the noise floor is just the background static of the universe, solar radiation, power lines, atmospheric pressure. It's always there, humming beneath the music. By 2 a.m., the station was in full automation mode. We were broadcasting a pre-recorded block of deep tracks from the 70 seconds. I was leaning back in the ergonomically broken Herman Miller chair, watching the VU meters bounce rhythmically to a Pink Floyd track. The isolation usually didn't bother me. I liked the technical precision of it. But that night, the air in the booth felt thick. Humidity in the server room was reading a steady 40%, but my skin felt clammy. The fluorescent lights overhead, usually a steady, sterile white, seemed to have a subtle, nauseating flicker that I could catch only in my peripheral vision. I checked the main output monitor. 96.5 FM was transmitting clearly. The signal strength was steady at 98%. Everything was green. Everything was normal. But then I looked at the spectrum analyzer, the waterfall display that visualizes every frequency our antenna picks up, not just the one we broadcast on. Usually, the unused frequencies are just a wash of blue static. Flat lines, dead air. But the far left of the screen, down in the low band where commercial radio isn't supposed to exist, was twitching. I squinted at the monitor, tapping the glass with my knuckle as if that would fix a digital readout. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. On the spectrum analyzer, the frequency band usually looks like a topographical map peaks where strong stations are broadcasting, valleys where there's static. But down at the bottom of the dial, at 87.3 megahertzes, a sharp, angry spike had erupted from the floor. That shouldn't be possible. In the United States, the commercial FM band starts at 88.1 megahertzes. Anything below that is reserved for TV Channel 6 audio, which is mostly defunct now, or low-power tests. There isn't a transmitter within 200 miles of this forest capable of pushing a signal that strong on that frequency. Glitch? I muttered, my voice sounding too loud in the acoustic foam-lined room. I swiveled my chair to the secondary rack and reset the receiver unit. The screen flickered black, the fans whirred down, and then the system rebooted. The familiar Windows XP startup sound chimed through the Q speaker. When the analyzer software loaded back up, the spike was still there. In fact, it was growing. Most radio signals fluctuate. They breathe, a song gets louder, the signal widens, a DJ stops talking, it narrows. The signal on 87.3 was solid. It was a black bar of pure energy, holding steady at negative 10 decibels. That's not a distant pirate radio station broadcasting from a basement. That's a signal strong enough to bleed into everything else. I felt a prickle of irritation. If the FCC caught wind of an unauthorized broadcast this powerful coming from our geographic location, I was the one who would have to file the paperwork. I pulled up the regional frequency map on the dedicated logging computer. I typed in 87.3 and hit search. 0 results found. Okay, funny guy, I said to the empty room. Someone's parked a mobile transmitter in the parking lot. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooks the transmitter yard. It was pitch black outside. The red safety lights on our main tower pulsed rhythmically, thump thump, thump thump, illuminating the swirling mist for a fraction of a second, before plunging the world back into darkness. There were no cars in the lot, no lights in the woods, just the oppressive wall of pine trees and the heavy, suffocating silence of the mountain. I walked back to the console. The spike on the screen hadn't moved. It sat there like a scar on the display, and then I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up. The VU meters for my station KROX 96.5 were dipping. Every time the unauthorized signal on 87.3 pulsed slightly, my station's output dropped by a fraction. It was parasitic. It was feeding off our power. I sat back down, my hand hovering over the Q button. In radio, the Q button allows you to listen to a source without broadcasting it to the world. It sends the audio strictly to the engineer's headphones. I shouldn't have been curious. I should have just logged it and called the station manager in the morning. But the isolation does things to your judgment. I put my headphones on, heavy, noise-canceling Sony MDRs that sealed tight against my skull. My finger pressed the button for 87.3. I expected static. I expected the harsh, jagged hiss of white noise that usually fills empty frequencies. Or maybe the garbled, alien-sounding chirps of digital interference. Instead, silence flooded my headphones. It wasn't the silence of an empty room, though. It was the silence of an occupied space. You know the difference. When you walk into a dark room and you can just feel someone else is there, it was that sensation, translated into audio. A low-frequency hum vibrated against my skull, deeper than the bass response of these headphones should allow. It felt like pressure building in my sinuses. Then, the sound started. It was a breath, wet, ragged. It sounded like air being forced through a throat coated in thick mucus or blood. It was shockingly high fidelity. Usually, radio signals, even good ones, have a bit of compression, a bit of distance. This sounded like the microphone was practically inside the person's mouth. I flinched, my hand jerking away from the console. The sound panned from my left ear to my right, a perfect stereo image that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. It felt like someone had just walked behind my chair, leaning over my shoulder to exhale directly into my ear canal. I spun around in my chair, ripping the headphones half off. The studio was empty, just the blinking lights of the server racks and the reflection of my own pale, wide-eyed face in the darkened glass of the observation window. I swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline in my mouth. Okay, I whispered. Okay, interference, cross-feed from a movie channel or something. I settled the headphones back over my ears, pressing them tight. I had to know. The breathing continued, steady and gross. But now there was something else underneath it. A rhythmic, heavy impact. Thud crunch. Thud crunch. It was the sound of metal striking earth. Heavy, wet soil. It was the sound of digging. I closed my eyes, trying to analyze the audio profile like a technician, trying to divorce myself from the fear. The acoustics were wrong. There was no wind noise, no crickets, no background traffic. Just that wet breathing and the relentless, exhausting sound of a shovel cutting into dirt. Thud crunch. Who is this? I asked into the talkback mic, my finger trembling on the button that would broadcast my voice to the Q channel. No answer. Just the work. Then, the rhythm changed. The digging stopped. There was a shuffling noise, like heavy fabric dragging across gravel. Sniff. The breathing stopped. A new sound emerged. It was a wet, smacking noise, like a dog chewing on a piece of raw steak, chewing with its mouth open. Schlock, schlock, crunch. My stomach rolled over. The bile rose in my throat, hot and acidic. The clarity was impossible. I could hear the saliva, the tearing of whatever it was. I reached out and slammed the volume pot down to 0. The silence of the room rushed back in, but the phantom sensation of that wet breath lingered in my ear, cold and invasive. I stared at the spectrum analyzer. The spike on 87.3 was pulsing now. It wasn't steady anymore. It was jumping in time with my own heart rate. The sudden shrill ring of the studio hotline made me jump so hard. My knee slammed into the underside of the desk. I stared at the phone console. The red light for line 1 was blinking furiously. At 2:23 a.m., the phone almost never rings. Usually, it's just drunks requesting Freebird or truckers asking about traffic on the pass. But tonight, that blinking light felt like a warning beacon. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady my heart rate, and picked up the receiver. KROX, you're on the air with Elias, I said, my voice cracking slightly.
Elias?
It was Martha. Martha is a 74-year-old widow who lives up on Ridge Road. She's one of our regulars, a sweet, lonely insomniac who usually calls to talk about her cats or request Fleetwood Mac. She's the kind of lady who brings cookies to the station at Christmas. But her voice wasn't sweet tonight. It was trembling. "Hey, Martha," I said, forcing a lighter tone. "Everything okay? A bit late for you." "Hell yes, honey," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "Please, make him stop. It's upsetting the dogs." I frowned, looking at the automation screen. Led Zeppelin's No Quarter was playing a moody, atmospheric track, but certainly not something that would upset dogs. "Make who stop, Martha? The music? I can skip to the next track if..." "No, not the music," she interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. The man crying. "Why are you playing that? It's horrible. He sounds like he's drowning." A cold drop of sweat rolled down my spine. "Martha," I said slowly, "I'm not playing a man crying. It's just Zeppelin." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, which was shockingly out of character. "I can hear him right now. He's screaming for help." He sang, oh God, he sang "It's Too Heavy." My blood ran cold. I immediately looked at the air monitor. This is the speaker that plays exactly what is being broadcasted out of our antenna towers. If there's a glitch, I hear it there. I cranked the volume knob up. Through the studio speakers, the haunting keyboard intro of No Quarter filled the room. It was crystal clear, no static, no interference, and definitely no crying man. "Martha," I said, pressing the phone tighter to my ear. "I'm listening to the feed right now. There's nothing there, just the music." "He's getting louder," she cried out. "He's sobbing, Elias. It sounds like he's right here in the room with me." "How can you not?" Then, I heard it. Not through the studio speakers. I heard it through the phone. In the background of Martha's call, underneath her panicked breathing, I heard a wet, gurgling sound. It was faint, tinny through the phone line, but distinct. "Please, lift it." It wasn't coming from her radio. The audio quality was too close. It sounded like the voice was on her end of the line. Or like it was inside the connection itself. "Martha, turn off your radio," I commanded. "Turn it off right now." I did," she sobbed. "I unplugged it, Elias. I unplugged it and he's still crying." The line went dead with a sharp click. I sat there, holding the dial tone to my ear, my hand trembling uncontrollably. I looked back at the spectrum analyzer. The spike on 87.3 had moved. It wasn't just a spike anymore. It was spreading. It was bleeding to the right, creeping toward the 96.5 band like an infection moving through veins. I dropped the phone receiver. It clattered against the desk, a plastic gunshot in the quiet room. Martha wasn't crazy. I knew that. And she wasn't hallucinating. The signal on 87.3 wasn't just sitting in the basement frequencies anymore. It was climbing. I could see it on the analyzer. A jagged black tear stretching horizontally across the screen, eating its way toward my station's output at 96.5. If that signal overlapped with ours, whatever was making those sounds, the chewing, the wet breathing, the digging, would be broadcast to every radio in a 50-mile radius. "Not on my shift," I hissed. I did what any engineer would do. I tried to jam it. I spun my chair to the auxiliary rack and powered up the emergency tone generator. Usually, we use this for calibration, sending a pure 1 kHz sine wave through the system to check levels. But if you crank the gain, it acts like a brute force wall of noise. I routed the generator to the auxiliary bus, intending to blast the lower frequencies with enough white noise to drown out the intruder. I reached for the aux send fader, the sliding switch that controls the volume of the generator. My finger hovered over the plastic knob. It was vibrating, not the subtle vibration of a cooling fan nearby. The fader was buzzing like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. I gritted my teeth and pressed my thumb against it to slide it up. Ah! I snatched my hand back, cradling it against my chest. The plastic was searing hot. I looked at my thumb. The skin was red and blistering. A perfect rectangular burn in the shape of the fader knob. What the hell? I grabbed a thick microfiber cloth from the cleaning kit, wrapped it around my hand, and shoved the fader up. It wouldn't move. It was physically stuck, as if welded to the faceplate. I pushed harder, putting my weight into it. The metal faceplate of the console groaned. Snap. The plastic knob shattered under the pressure. A spark, blue and angry, arced from the open slider slot, stinging my wrist. The smell of burning silicon and melting plastic instantly filled the small booth, acrid and choking. I coughed, waving the smoke away, and looked up at the main output meters, the two needles that show how loud we're broadcasting. The room was silent. I had muted the monitors. The Q channel was off, but the needles on the VU meters were pinned. They were slammed all the way to the right, buried in the red danger zone, vibrating against the plastic limiters. Thwack, thwack, thwack. I could hear the physical needles hitting the glass casing. That's impossible. Meters measure voltage. They measure sound. If there is no sound, there is no voltage. But they were maxed out. And then, the lights in the studio dimmed. Not a flicker. A slow, brown-out dimming, as if something massive had just turned on in the building, and was sucking all the amperage from the grid. The hum of the servers deepened, struggling against the power draw. I looked at the spectrum analyzer again. The black spike on 87.3 had changed shape. It wasn't a jagged line anymore. As I watched, the static organized itself. The peaks and valleys of the waveform weren't random. They were uniform. Square waves. It wasn't just noise. It was data. My hand was still throbbing, the red welt on my thumb pulsing in time with the dimming lights. But the fear was momentarily overridden by a cold, analytical curiosity. I'm an engineer. When things break, I fix them. When things don't make sense, I find the data that explains why. The needles on the VU meters were still pinned to the right, but the room was silent. The signal on 87.3 had stopped sounding like wet chewing. Now, visually, it was a stream of perfect, rigid blocks. It's ancient software, discontinued years ago, but it's stable. I routed the 87.3 feed into the editor and hit record. The waveform drew itself across the screen in real time. It wasn't the chaotic, fuzzy squiggles of voice or music. It was a cityscape of sharp angles. High block, low block, high block, low block. Screech, gauge, gauge. I unmuted the monitors for a split second, just to confirm. A harsh, rhythmic digital screech tore through the air, sounding like a dial-up modem being strangled. I slammed the mute button back down. "It's not audio," I whispered, leaning closer to the CRT monitor until I could see the individual pixels. "It's data." I zoomed in. The pulses were uniform. A long burst of noise followed by a short silence. Then 2 short bursts. It wasn't Morse code. It was binary. High voltage for 1, low voltage for 0. I highlighted a 10-second chunk of the recording and ran a simple frequency analysis script I'd written years ago to debug RDS encoders. It stripped away the carrier wave and left me with a raw text string of ones and zeros. 0100111, 000000000001100110011001100. I grabbed a notepad and a pen. I didn't need a converter. I'd memorized the ASCII table back in college during a particularly boring semester of digital logic. I started transcribing the clusters, my pen scratching loudly against the paper in the quiet room. Number 4. 4. My stomach tightened. Degrees. 1. 4. It was a latitude. I kept writing, the numbers spilling out faster than I could process them. The signal looped every 30 seconds, repeating the same string over and over. N, 44 degrees, 14. 22.8 W 122 degrees, 09041. I stared at the notepad. Those were GPS coordinates. I swiveled to the logging computer, the one with the only internet connection in the room, and opened Google Earth. My fingers felt clumsy and thick as I typed the numbers into the search bar. The globe spun, zooming in from space to North America, then Oregon, then the Willamette National Forest. It kept zooming. The green canopy of the trees filled the screen. I expected it to point to a town, or maybe a cemetery, or the middle of a lake. The camera stopped its descent. The red pin dropped. I sat there, frozen, the air in the room suddenly feeling very thin. The pin hadn't dropped in a town. It had dropped on the edge of a clearing dominated by a small concrete building with a large radio tower behind it. The coordinates were for the station, but they weren't for the building I was sitting in. They were pinpointed about 300 yards due west, deep in the dense tree line behind the transmitter yard. I knew that spot. That was where the old tower used to be, the one that collapsed in the storm of '98, the one they never fully cleared away, because the ground was too unstable to bring heavy machinery in. I looked back at the spectrum analyzer. The binary screeching had stopped. The wet breathing was back, and this time it sounded satisfied. I should have called the police. I should have called the station manager. I should have run. But the logic part of my brain, the part that insists every input has an output, every effect has a cause, was stuck on a loop. Why broadcast your own location? If this was a prank, the transmitter had to be portable. If it was a distress signal, why the wet chewing sounds? I needed history. The digital logs only went back to 2005. Everything before that was paper, stored in the morgue, a windowless storage closet at the back of the hallway that smelled of mildew and decomposing cardboard. I grabbed the heavy mag light from under the console. The hallway was dark, the emergency lights casting long distorted shadows against the acoustic tiling. I walked past the darkened production studios, their glass windows looking like black eyes watching me pass. The morgue was freezing. The air was stagnant, heavy with dust. I swept the flashlight beam across rows of bankers' boxes, stacked floor to ceiling. 1,988. 1,989. 1,995. I found the box labeled 1998 ENG Translogs. I pulled it down, dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam. I flipped it open. The paper inside was yellowed, brittle to the touch. I flipped to October, the month the old tower went down. The 12th of October, 1998. Routine maintenance. Guy wire tension check. The 13th of October, 1998. Storm warning. Backup generator primed. Then, the handwriting changed. The entries for the 14th weren't written in the neat blocky print of the previous engineer. They were scrawled, jagged. The pen had pressed so hard it had torn through the paper in places. The 14th of October, 1998, 2:14 a.m. Interference on lower band, 87.3. Source unknown. My heart hammered against my ribs. The exact same time, the exact same date, 2:45 a.m. Sounds like digging. Who was digging in the storm? I turned the page. The writing got worse. It was erratic, sloping down the page as if the writer couldn't keep his hand steady. 3:10 a.m. It's not interference. It's coming from the ground. The ground is leaking. And then, the final entry for the night. The ink was dark, smeared. 87.3 is hungry tonight. There were no entries for the next 3 days. The log picked up again on October 18th, in a different, unfamiliar handwriting. The 18th of October, 1998. New chief engineer on site. Previous personnel, M. Henderson. Missing. Police report filed. Note, old tower collapse confirmed. Debris field inaccessible. I stared at the name. M. Henderson. I knew that name. Mike Henderson. There was a plaque in the lobby dedicated to him. In memory of Mike Henderson, lost in the storm of '98. Everyone assumed he'd been driving home when his car was swept away by a mudslide. They never found the body, but he hadn't left. The logbook said he was here at 3:10 a.m. The storm hadn't taken him. I looked at the last line again. 87.3 is hungry tonight. A heavy thud from down the hall made me drop the book. It wasn't the settling of the building. It was the sound of a heavy fire door slamming shut. The door to the transmitter yard. I sprinted back down the hallway, the beam of my maglite jerking wildly against the walls. The heavy steel door to the exterior transmitter yard was at the far end of the corridor, past the bathrooms. It was closed, locked. The push bar was secure, but there was a puddle of water on the linoleum floor right in front of the threshold. Muddy, brown water, and in the center of the puddle, a single decaying pine needle. I didn't stop to investigate. I bolted back into the main control room and slammed the heavy soundproof door behind me, engaging the deadbolt. My chest was heaving. my lungs burning from the sudden exertion and the panic that was now fully coursing through my veins. Safe. The booth is safe. It's a Faraday cage. It's reinforced. But the moment the door clicked shut, I realized the atmosphere inside had changed. The smell hit me first. The acrid scent of the burnt fader, that sharp electric ozone sting, was still there, hanging near the ceiling. But underneath it was something else. Something heavy and organic. It smelled like wet wool and deep, turned earth. It was the smell of a root cellar that hasn't been opened in decades. The smell of worms. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. The air conditioning vent above the console was blowing full blast, but the air coming out wasn't cold. It was damp. I looked at the monitors. The automation system was still playing. The Eagles, Hotel California. Typical reliable filler. But the spectrum analyzer on the left screen was still dominated by the black bar on 87.3. I grabbed the headphones. I had to know. I pulled the cans over my ears, my hands shaking so badly the cable rattled against the desk. The breathing was loud, immediate. I leaned back in the chair, trying to catch my own breath. I was panting short, sharp gasps of air. I froze. The rhythm in the headphones. When it was fast. Too fast for a recording of a man digging a hole. It was perfectly in time, with my chest rising and falling. I sat very still. I forced myself to take a long, slow inhale through my nose, counting to 4. The sound in the headphones matched me. A long, wet drag of air. I held it. Silence in the headphones. Absolute dead silence. Not even the crackle of static. Just the heavy, waiting void. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, thump, thump. And then, through the headphones, underneath the silence, thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a loop. I let my breath out in a sharp, terrified exhale. Huh! The sound in the headphones exploded with the same force, but it didn't sound like air escaping a throat anymore. It sounded like air escaping a punctured lung, bubbling, wet. Stop it, I whispered. In the headphones, a voice, a distortion of my own voice, pitch shifted down 3 octaves, caked in mud, whispered back. Stop it. I ripped the headphones off and threw them across the room. They hit the far wall with a crack, but I could still hear it. The sound wasn't just in the cans anymore. It was coming from the air vents. A low, resonant vibration shaking the metal grates above my head. The smell of dirt grew stronger, choking out the ozone. It felt like the room was filling up with soil, invisible but heavy, pressing against my skin. The soundproof glass separating the control room from the main hallway is triple paned, angled downwards to prevent reflections. At night, it usually acts as a black mirror, reflecting nothing but the blinking LEDs of the server racks and my own terrified face. I was pressed against the back wall of the booth, staring at that black rectangle of glass. The air in the room was stifling, heavy with that cellar dirt smell. Then, out in the pitch-black hallway, the lights snapped on. Click buzz. The cheap fluorescent tubes flickered to life, bathing the corridor in a harsh, sterile yellow wash. My heart seized. The hallway lights are controlled by a Leviton infrared occupancy sensor mounted above the break room door. It's set to a 15-minute timer. It only triggers if it detects significant movement, a person walking, a door opening. I didn't breathe. I scanned the illuminated strip of hallway visible through the glass. The water cooler bubbled. The poster of the Rolling Stones from their '72 tour hung crookedly on the wall. The door to the sales office was closed. There was no one there. Rats, I whispered, the word feeling like sand in my mouth. It's just rats. I kept my eyes locked on the empty corridor, waiting for the lights to time out. But they didn't. They stayed on. I glanced back at the monitors. The spectrum analyzer told a different story. The moment the lights had turned on, the black bar on 87.3 had shot up. It wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a wall. The signal strength was reading +5 decibels. That's louder than our main broadcast. And it was moving. The waveform on the screen was shifting from left to right, scrolling across the frequency band. I looked back at the hallway. Still empty. Then, the lights flickered. Not a power surge. They went out completely for a full second, plunging the hall into darkness. Click buzz. They snapped back on. But something was different. The motion sensor has a small red LED that blinks when it detects active movement. Blink, blink, blink. The little red eye was flashing furiously. It was tracking something. Something was walking down the center of the hallway, moving directly toward the glass of the soundproof booth. I backed up until my spine hit the edge of the mixing console. Blink, blink. The sensor tracked the invisible movement past the water cooler, past the bathroom door. Blink. It stopped right in front of the window. The lights in the hallway stayed on, humming that angry electrical buzz. I was staring at a patch of empty linoleum floor, maybe 3 feet from the glass. There was nothing there, but on the console, the overload light for the studio microphone, the one inside the room with me, lit up red. The needle on the VU meter slammed against the glass casing. Thwack. It wasn't measuring sound from the room. It was measuring proximity. The glass window vibrated. A low, resonant thrum passed through the pane, like a subwoofer testing its limits. Condensation began to form on the outside of the glass. Not a mist. It was a patch of fog, roughly the size and shape of a human hand, pressing against the pane. Then another patch appeared beside it. 2 handprints, steaming up the glass from the empty hallway. They pushed. The triple-paned glass groaned. The glass groaned again, a sound like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The 2 patches of condensation were distinct now palm prints, fingers splayed wide, pressing with impossible force against the safety glass. But there were no arms attached to them, just the empty, yellow-lit hallway, and the angry red eye of the motion sensor blinking above the door frame. I backed up until I hit the server racks. The metal handles dug into my spine. "Go away," I whispered. It was a pathetic, childish plea. The console lit up like a Christmas tree. Every button on the Wheatstone bridge flashed red simultaneously. Then, the main studio monitor's massive Genelec speakers mounted in the corners of the ceiling exploded with sound. Usually, when the in-studio microphone is active, the monitors automatically mute to prevent feedback loops. It's a hardwired safety feature. But the system had bypassed the logic board entirely. SCCRRRREE. A blast of high-pitched digital feedback tore through the room. I clapped my hands over my ears, falling to my knees. The sound was physical. It rattled my teeth and vibrated the fluid in my inner ear. Then, the feedback cut out instantly. Absolute silence returned. The kind of silence that hurts. The handprints on the glass didn't move. They were still pressing. Then, the speakers spoke. Elias. My blood froze. It wasn't the wet, gurgling voice from 87.3. It wasn't the old woman on the phone. It was my voice. It was a perfect, high-fidelity sample of me saying my own name, likely ripped from the station ID I'd recorded 3 months ago. But the cadence was wrong. It was too flat, too digital. "Elias," the speaker said again. Louder this time. The bass drivers in the monitors pushed air that hit my face like a slap. I stared at the console. The faders were all at 0. The master volume was off. The equipment shouldn't be passing audio. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The response came immediately, stitched together from different words I'd spoken over the years, probably pulled from the logging archives. The tone shifted pitch with every syllable, creating a jagged, nauseating sentence. "It is cold." The voice sounded like it was rotting. The cold was drawn out, distorted into a low growl that shook the floorboards. "It is heavy." The glass window gave a loud pop. A spiderweb fracture appeared right between the 2 ghostly handprints. The condensation was starting to drip down the pane, mixing with the dust to form muddy streaks. "Elias," my own voice boomed from the walls, deafeningly loud. "Open the door." The command hit me with the force of a physical blow. The door wasn't a sample. It was a scream, my scream synthesized into a word. "Open the door." The fracture in the glass expanded, shooting out toward the edges of the frame. "Open the door." I scrambled to my feet, my boots slipping on the slick floor. The lock on the studio door rattled violently. The heavy steel handle turned slowly, grinding against the deadbolt I had engaged earlier. It wasn't just outside. It was manipulating the mechanism from the inside. Open. The studio lights blew out. Darkness didn't just fall. It slammed into the room like a physical weight. The only illumination came from the dying glow of the vacuum tube amplifiers in the corner. and the frantic, strobing red LEDs of the overload indicators. The room was vibrating. I couldn't tell if it was the floor shaking or my own bones rattling, from the sheer decibel level of the speakers. Open the door. My voice, booming from the monitors, had dissolved into a digital roar. It sounded like a corrupted MP3 file screaming in agony. I was on my hands and knees, crawling through the tangle of cables under the desk. The air tasted metallic, like licking a 9-volt battery. My hair was standing on end. The static electricity in the room was so intense that small blue sparks were arcing between the metal rack rails. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight a ghost. I couldn't fight a frequency, but I could kill the carrier wave. The entity, Mike, the thing in the dirt, whatever it was riding the 50,000-watt signal like a highway. It was using the RF energy to manifest. If I cut the power to the main transmitter, the highway disappears. The plate-off switched the emergency kill button that severs the connection to the main 480-volt three-phase power supply was on the bottom of the main rack, near the door, right where the handle was turning. I scrambled forward, my palms sliding on the linoleum. The smell of wet earth was overpowering now, choking out the oxygen. It felt like I was buried alive. Crash. Above me, the triple-pane safety glass finally gave way. It didn't shatter like a window. It exploded inward like a pressurized cockpit canopy. Shards of thick, heavy glass rained down on the console and the floor. A gust of wind hit me, not air from the hallway, but a cold, damp draft that smelled of rotting pine needles. Something wet slapped onto the floor inches from my hand. I didn't look up. I lunged for the rack. Do not. The voice wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from the broken window. It was wet, guttural, and right above me. I slammed my shoulder into the metal server rack, fumbling in the strobing red darkness for the safety cover of the kill switch. My fingers brushed against the steel casing of the Harris transmitter unit. It was searing hot. "Ah!" I yelled, the metal blistering my fingertips. I found the plastic guard. I ripped it off, the plastic snapping. Something grabbed my ankle. It didn't feel like a hand. It felt like a loop of cold, wet rope. Or a root. It tightened, dragging me backward toward the shattered window. "Mine!" the voice gurgled. I kicked out, my boot connecting with something soft that yielded like mud. I clawed at the rack, my fingernails scraping against the metal. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that was lost in the cacophony of the room, and threw my entire body weight forward. My palm slammed into the large, red, rectangular button. Thunk! The sound of the heavy-duty contactors opening in the back room was louder than a gunshot. It was a mechanical, final sound. The hum of the 50,000-watt transmitter died instantly. The LEDs on the console winked out. The speakers went dead. The screaming stopped. The grip on my ankle vanished. For a second, the only sound was the high-pitched whine of capacitors draining power. Yee, yee. Fading into nothing. Then, silence. Absolute, heavy, ringing silence. I lay curled in a ball on the floor, surrounded by broken glass, gasping for air in the pitch-black room. The smell of ozone lingered, but the smell of wet earth was gone. I didn't move for a long time. I just lay there, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, waiting for the backup generator to kick in. It never did. I sat in the dark for 4 hours. I didn't move until the sun started to bleed through the cracks, in the heavy blackout curtains of the lobby, casting long gray beams across the shattered glass on the studio floor. When Dave, the morning drive DJ, unlocked the front door at 6:30 a.m., he found me curled up under the console, clutching my burnt hand, shivering in a room that was 65 degrees. The official report said I suffered a stress-induced psychotic break caused by isolation and sleep deprivation. The station manager, a man named Mr. Sterling who cared more about ad revenue than human life, fired me before the paramedics even finished checking my vitals. You don't take a 50,000-watt station off the air for 4 hours and keep your job. Dead air is death, he told me, standing over me while I sat on the back bumper of the ambulance. He didn't care about the shattered safety glass. He claimed I must have thrown a chair through it in a rage, even though the glass was blown inward, covering the console, not the hallway. He didn't care about the melted plastic on the transmitter kill switch. He didn't care about the digital logs, which had conveniently corrupted during the power outage. I didn't fight him. I just wanted to leave. It's been 6 months since that night. I moved 3 hours away, to a basement apartment in Portland. I work at a warehouse now, stacking boxes. It's quiet, no electronics, no transmitters. But I'm not free. The doctors say I have severe tinnitus. They say the trauma damaged my auditory nerves, causing a phantom ringing. But tinnitus is a high-pitched whine. What I hear isn't a whine. I hear it in the white noise. That's where it hides now. When I take a shower, the sound of the water hitting the tile floor creates a frequency mask. And in that mask, I hear the wet, rhythmic breathing. When I turn on a fan to sleep, I hear the sound of a shovel hitting dirt. Thud crunch. I've ripped the radio out of my car. I don't own a TV. I live in silence. Because the moment there is static, the moment there is a chaotic sound wave for it to latch onto, the signal returns. Last week, I walked past a construction site. A jackhammer was tearing up the pavement. The noise was deafening, but underneath the mechanical roar, clear as day, I heard my own voice, distorted and rotting, whisper in my ear, "Open the door." I know the station is still running. I checked the FCC database. They replaced the glass and the transmitter parts. They probably hired some kid fresh out of college who thinks working the graveyard shift is a cool way to break into the industry. If you are reading this, and you live in the Pacific Northwest, do me a favor. When you're driving late at night, scanning through the channels, and you hit the bottom of the dial, don't stop. If your radio tunes down past 88.1, and you see the numbers 87.3 glowing on your dashboard, turn it off. Pull the car over. Get out. Because if you listen closely enough to hear the breathing, it's already too late. It knows you're listening. And it is so hungry.